Hi guys. So today I'd like to talk about the legend of Tristan and Isolde and how that relates specifically to the concept of Fin Amor. I know that we've talked about Fin Amor previously, but with this tale I'd like to explore the possibility that Fin Amor actually doesn't exist here due to the insertion of an outside entity into the relationship between the two main characters. For those of you that aren't familiar with the tale, let me give you just a very basic rundown of what happens. So basically, the two main characters, Tristan and Isolde, meet by happenstance, and they consume, in most tales, unbeknownst to them, a love potion which was intended to be ingested by Isolde and her soon-to-be king husband Mark. And that just happens to be Tristan's uncle. So instead of Isolde living happily ever after with Mark, she is absolutely head over heels for Tristan, and he's the same way for her. And it gets a little bit hairy after they get back to court because Tristan is torn between his love for Isolde and his chivalric duties and loyalty to his uncle. So the game changer here really is the love potion. And so let's look at how that affects the concept of Fin Amor. So if you look up a common definition of Fin Amor, you will typically find it described as a medieval European literary conception of love that emphasize nobility and chivalry. If you break it down to how men viewed this concept and how women viewed it, there are some very different perceptions. According to William McBain, in reference to men, anyone who is on fire with Fin Amor knows no peace or joy. So mainly he boils it down to lust and dissatisfaction for men. And from what we've read, I can see that. The knights of this time period had a duty to society, and breaching that trust would have gone completely against what they stood for. McBain also notes a slightly difference in meaning of Fin Amor in its application to the lady. And fina appears sometimes to have the sense of elegante, and it's something that is given rather than experienced. So this all really, in a plotline sense, added to the drama of the story and packed it with more emotion in order to grab the reader's attention. In most cases of courtly love, the two participants are not in control of their emotions. They simply can't help themselves. They must give each other their love no matter what complications are going to arise. And so typically the Fin Amor came about organically. But here there was an outside source introduced. The love potion became an external factor. So how does that change the concept of Fin Amor between Tristan and Isolde? Let's just keep that question in mind as we move through this presentation and ultimately think about if this situation even qualifies as Fin Amor in the end. To offer a little comparison, I wanted to look at three different depictions of this tale. And I wanted to start with the classics, going from Tristan by Godfrey von Strasbourg and La Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, and then vaulting into modern times with Tristan and Isolde, which was released by 20th Century Fox. So here we have Tristan by Gottfried von Strasbourg, and it was written around 1210. So this was created in the early 13th century. He designed a work that reflected the emotional hardships of an arranged marriage. And Isolde's mother anticipated her daughter's despair at leaving her homeland, and Strasbourg tells us, "The prudent queen was brewing in a vial a love drink so subtly, devised and prepared, and endowed with such power, that with whomever any man drink it had to love her alone, and they would share one death and one life, one sorrow and one joy." We also know that there were only platonic feelings that were felt between them, because on their voyage back to Cornwall, he also tells us, "And so Tristan would console her tenderly as he could. Always, when he came and found her sorrowing, he took her in his arms gently and quietly, and in no other way than a liege might hand his lady." So the reader is explicitly told of the non-romantic relationship. The potent love potion was ingested by these two characters without their knowledge of its purpose. But how does that reflect on our images of courtly love? We know they weren't more than friends before they drank it, so can the love they feel after its consumption even be considered true love? Or love at all? In Stephen Schauber's critical review of the work, he stated that even Godfred's conception of love departs from the courtly pattern, for rather than the usual unfulfilled longing and devoted service of the knight, love in this story is mutual, freely given, and outside the conventions of courtly society. It is a law unto itself and destructive of the social order. But the question is their love actually freely given? Had they just been two ordinary people, this love could have very well happened organically. There are infinite possibilities of paths their stories could take, but here they really have no choice. They hadn't fallen in love up until this point, but after taking the potion, unknowingly, they have no other options. They can't fall out of love. The deed is already done, so to speak, so they have no option. That is the real point in respect to Fin Amor. Had they taken the potion, they may never have loved each other at all romantically, but by introducing an external force, they never got to make their own decisions anymore in respect to each other. And ultimately, according to Will Hasty, the court persecutes, banishes, and ultimately destroys the lovers because they represent an unacceptable and threatening alternative to the existing order of chivalry. So, let's venture back into Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory. As we've discussed before, this text was published in 1485 and has become one of the texts of Arthurian tales. Even though the content is wrapped around King Arthur and those knights of his Round Table, in Book 8 he gives us some insight into the life and adventures of Sir Tristram. Where Strasbourg offered us an emotional side of Isolde's departure from Ireland, Malory gives us a more romanticized version of events. Once the two have been brought together, Malory tells us that Tramtrist cast great love to La Belle Isolde, for she was at that time the fairest maid and lady of the world, and there Tramtrist learned her to harp, and she began to have a great fantasy unto him. This is more along the lines of courtly love we're used to. One would almost think that this is where the concept of Fin Amor would stop, already having been fulfilled. But then the queen, Isolde's mother, gave her to Dame Bragwaine, her daughter's gentlewoman, and to Gouvernail a drink, and charged them that what day King Mark should wed, that same day they should give him that drink, so that King Mark should drink to La Belle Isolde, and then, said the queen, I undertake either shall love others the days of their life. And then anon Sir Tramtrist took to the sea, and La Belle Isolde, and where they were in their cabin, it happed so that they were thirsty, and they saw a little flasket of gold stand by them, and it seemed by the color and the taste that it was noble wine. I think what has transpired definitely has to change how we're looking at courtly love. I mean, yes, there are some feelings floating around, but nothing certain. It very well could have been the ending that would have occurred naturally, but then it could just as easily have been the opposite. This applies to Fin Amor most specifically because of Tristan's role as knight. Without the potion, he could have decided that his chivalric duty was too great, and that his loyalty to his uncle wasn't worth breaking. In the end, we'll never know, because his choices were actually taken away. His free will to adhere by or ignore his chivalric duties were gone. So here I have the film Tristan and Isolde, which was released in 2006. I chose this because it's one of the more modern takes on the legend. One of the main points that I wanted to bring up is how society wants to be entertained in our era versus the older texts I used as examples. This, by all accounts, is a typical love story. All of the events are overdone and the happenings are quite elaborate, but in these, there's no love potion. Here the two main characters fall in love because of the situation they are put in, and are actually blindsided when they find out Isolde will be marrying Tristan's uncle Mark. So does this application of love make Fin Amor more apparent? I think that the answer is yes, it certainly does. There's no question of their love for each other here. There are no conditions, no unanswered questions. They met, they fell in love. But Tristan has a hard time dealing with his betrayal of his chivalric code, and for that reason, it is a classic example of courtly love. If we put this in the context of the other stories, and they had drank a love potion, would I have drawn the same conclusion? Well, in every version, the two main characters find themselves in love. Although the validity of it in each story can be questioned, all the stories do fall under the context of courtly love for the sheer fact that Tristan is a knight, and he has a loyalty to his king. And this is apparent in both von Strasberg and Fox productions. But in Mallory's, although Tristan serves Mark, he isn't always bothered by his own actions. Another important factor for knights is their strict code to religion, and in all three texts, you can see Fin Amor as a single human being might not be worth of the sort of love that was formerly reserved for God, as described by Simon May, which puts an angle on courtly love that is a test of the knights involved. Even if we look back to the other works we've studied, for example, those of Chrétien de Troyes, you can see that the joy of love is greater when there are impediments to its realization, as described by Douglas Kelly. In all of these accounts, we could make an argument for the presence of Fin Amor, but it all comes down to the love potion. In the two tales involving potion, there cannot be a firm label of courtly love because the characters were robbed of their ability to make their own decisions. Once the potion was ingested, they could no longer fight through their doubts about the situation and base their decisions of what was right. The love potion is the clink in the armor. This is the factor that is the most important. If the love potion is present when we call into question the actual relationship between the two, there was no way to know what they would have done once they made it back to Cornwall. They could have called the whole thing off just as easily as they could have remained in their affair. When analyzing it critically for the presence of Fin Amor, I would say the only definite case of that would be in the modern film, and the other two have the external force, one that contaminates the true meaning of courtly love.